about a whole bunch of different statutes and a whole bunch of types of research. And one thing that I think it's important to know is where animals fit within different areas of laboratory research. Because in some of those areas, we've made rapid progress away from animals. In other areas, we haven't made much progress at all. And it's important not to lump them together, because if you lump them together, you miss the opportunities in the specific areas, I think. So I want to do that now by just breaking up science into 4 domains. I like to think about science in this way because it helps me understand also the legal overlay. So first there's discovery science or basic research. And discovery science and basic research is looking for unknowns, trying to fill gaps in knowledge. It's what a lot of my colleagues at Hopkins do. They run labs, they try to cure diseases, they try to develop new treatments. That is a type of science now that does use a lot of animal models. And in fact, the default when you're a graduate student in that field is to develop an animal model for something. Okay? A lot of those I'd say are still rodent models, at least in my department, mostly because my department works on environmental issues. But that's going to be difficult to change in the near term. We have some great new technologies coming online with these, I'm sure you've heard of them, organ on a chip sort of thing, the biomimetics. Those are rapidly advancing, but still the animal model is, in a lot of ways, the first step out in discovery or basic research. The second area is drug development. And drug development spans discovery research and then gets into regulatory toxicology and decision making. So think about it. If you're going to develop a drug, the first thing you have to do is you have to find molecules that might be good drugs. That's discovery research. But once you find those molecules, then you have to make sure the molecules actually work. So if you have a molecule, let's say, that you think is going to potentially be an asthma drug, it actually has to affect the airways in a way that would benefit an asthmatic. And oh, by the way, it can't affect the liver in a way that would shut the liver down, because that results in this condition we call death. And that's not really good for drugs, okay? So you've got to do discovery research, but you also have to do research that demonstrates that the drug is safe and effective, because those are the standards on the FFDCA. So that sort of spans discovery as well as regulatory research. Then there's the field that we're talking about today, which is toxicology, and that's testing of chemicals in the market. That is a field of regulatory toxicology. A lot of what we're doing in the regulatory toxicology field is trying to develop data to answer a question. The question is often, is it safe? Or at what level is it safe? Or in the case of a pesticide, because pesticides basically are engineered to kill things. And the difference between what pesticides do to small things and big things like us is often a matter of dose. So pesticide information has to be, okay, how do I apply this? And where can I apply this? And who can apply it? So all of that kind of regulatory science, that's all a lot of what toxicology does. But that's a different domain of science. Now, I happen to think that we have a really good start in moving quickly away from animals in this area. One of the reasons is because of a report Dr. Casey mentioned, which came out about 9 years ago, the Toxicity Testing in the 21st Century report. The National Academy of Sciences reports can either sit on the shelf or they can be acted on. This one, like the chimp one, was acted on. The federal agencies got together, they put money behind this, and they've developed new methodologies to try to move away from animal tests. Challenges remain. I think Dr. Casey did a great job of explaining what those challenges are, but we're on the right road there. Finally, there are things like safety testing for cosmetics. And safety testing for cosmetics is very interesting. As Anna pointed out, the Humane Cosmetics Act was introduced in the House. That would basically eliminate all animal testing for cosmetics, finished products as well as components over a timeline, with maybe a couple of exceptions. There's a European directive that's very similar to that. So for cosmetics, we're in a situation where I think you can see in the horizon, we might actually reach a state where we don't use any animals for cosmetics at all. But keep in mind that these are different, and that we're going to make progress in toxicology and we're likely to make progress in cosmetics. The progress in these other areas might be slower, but it still will happen. So don't get frustrated. I wanted to just end by pointing out that if you're interested in any of these things, let me know. I think actually, as I said, the most interesting thing on this is the citation to YouTube, which is kind of my go-to place now for all my science and law. And also wanted to let you know, if you want to contact me, I'd love to talk to you more about this issue. And I really do hope that you get involved and stay involved. It's important for advocates to step up and say that we need to move to a world where we're developing and using more alternatives. Congress and people at federal agencies respond to that. They want to do the right thing. And scientists are very entrepreneurial, and they want to do the right thing too. So help us. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Dr. Locke, and thank you to all of our wonderful panelists. So we're now going to do some question and answer. So if anyone has a question now, if you want to raise your hand, be happy to call on Donnie.
So I'm not exactly sure who to direct this to, but actually you talked about the entrenched systems that will make the process of transitioning away from animal testing, make it difficult or a long process. But what about, you still see stories about maybe it's the NIH funding psychological studies, maternal deprivation studies, why are we still doing that? And what can be done to stop that? Do we really need to do these redundant studies to figure out the psychological impact of depriving monkeys of their mothers?
So that's a very good question. I think we're going to have to address, so that's a research question more versus a regulatory toxicology question. So there are certain tests that are required. Those type of tests, there are some neurobehavioral tests that are required for certain drugs. But what we're trying to do right now is just focus on the ones across the board that are required. If we can start being really predictive about those, I think we can start working our way down to convince people that there are other ways to do these other tests. But I think you have to have some success somewhere first. And the cognitive aspect is just, it's already a challenging question, but that's a really difficult portion of an already challenging task. So if we can start with the low-hanging fruit and then work our way out, I think that's going to be the approach.
Those aren't related to drug development, are they? When we see these horrific studies.
Not the maternal deprivation studies, no. I think there's, as Dr. Casey was saying, there's so much inertia in the system, right? That, like with chimp research, we saw for years laboratories getting grants for care and maintenance of chimps over and over and over again, and they weren't even producing science from those grants. They were basically getting those grants to pay salaries, turn lights on in the labs, and using that federal cash cow effectively to continue work. And once the scientific community coalesced around recognizing that that research was not beneficial, then you started seeing some of the walls breaking down. And with respect to maternal deprivation, there's the University of Wisconsin studies have been highly criticized. They absolutely are repeating stuff that was done 40 years ago, in my opinion, and I think it's a pretty widely shared opinion, totally unnecessary from a scientific perspective, not associated with any drug development or required under any federal or state law. And I think that is the low-hanging fruit, and that there has been a lot of vocal opposition to it. And I think one of the interesting things, Dr. Locke's kind of call to action, I think is fantastic and has a lot of opportunity on these liberal college campuses where a lot of these major laboratories are. The number of students that are at the University of Wisconsin at Madison who disagree with their tuition dollars supporting that type of research, I think is enormous, and that needs to be brought to light. And fortunately, that research, that particular study at Wisconsin from a couple years ago, was brought to light because somebody within the university's administration basically became a whistleblower. And I think we are seeing movement there, but we've got to pick up that low-hanging fruit while recognizing that we have some entrenched problems that are going to take longer to solve.
And I think, good.
I don't really know much about that research, so I can't speak to to its value. But what I can tell you is, and I think this is one thing that Anna pointed out, is that once the research community coalesces around the idea that the research is not helpful, or the model is wrong, because a lot of the NIH was like, well, we had these chimps and we thought we were going to use them to study HIV, and there were a couple of other diseases, but it turns out they just weren't very good models. Then the scientific rationale disappears. Now, that, by the way, is one thing I think that lawyers do particularly well. Lawyers learn things quickly, and they can synthesize all this information. So think about that from a perspective of an advocate. The other thing I'll note, and I don't quite know where this goes, is that if you look at the Animal Welfare Act, one of the congressional findings in the Animal Welfare Act is that the act was to be put in place to prevent duplication. I don't know that we've ever done anything with that.
So I'll also add that the reason this whole initiative that I'm working on now started 2 years ago with a colleague of mine in pharma coming to me and saying, why is NIH continuing to pour money into animal models that are useless? They don't work. Put the money someplace else. Figure out a better way to do it. Stop doing the same thing over and over again. And so that's when we started thinking, okay, how can we convince NIH? Because you're not going to have people that do the animal research come back and say, you know what, this doesn't work. Don't give us any money. I think we have to continue to look at it from the financial standpoint, from the incentives. How do you incentivize the use of these methods? So I'm from North Carolina, and tobacco was the huge crop. You can't have the federal government come in and say, no more tobacco. They said, okay, here's some money to grow soybeans. So how do you start that transition of providing an incentive to people to move away from animal models that they know don't work to things that could work? And I think that's got to be a big part of this conversation.
My question is, because, I mean, mostly I'm an activist, and at times I spend, my days signing like 30 different petitions, and in essence it's globally, and often I find that they're basically the same petition in terms of the same exact group of animals saying stop doing this. And there's been a time or two when all of them indeed have been animal testing across the board. And so in terms of what you sort of were mentioning about the concept of standards, is it a good pressure point to say, hey, this other country, they're not using that research method anymore? Is it a matter of exerting, saying, look across the globe, here's 5 other places on the planet that aren't doing that. Can you get on board, as opposed to trying to say to them, do it new? Because again,
I think there's a misimpression about how progressive or how productive Europe has been. I think if you look at the actual number of animals saved, even in the past year, through the EPA, for example, saying if you have a acute oral toxicity test where you feed an animal the drug or chemical until it dies, there's no value in doing a skin test and an inhalation test. But every other country in the world still requires all those tests, and they've come out and said, okay, if you have one, you don't need the other ones because we know this is bad enough. You're not getting any value. And so I think there's 2 approaches. You either try to harmonize everything up front, or you just do it and take a leadership position. That's what this is U.S. focus. We work with international partners all the time. Now Canada has adopted that EPA stance and taking it one step further even. If you look at the work we did with the endocrine disruptor screening program, where we used completely non-animal methods to identify endocrine disruptors, that would have taken a decade in Europe. We just did it. And now the Europeans are using data out of the Toxicology program. So I think there's a lot to be said for harmonization, but we've also haven't had a lot of success. I mean, I don't know if you're familiar with the Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development, OECD, sets standards. I'm on committees, and they're very happy to go to Paris, have a meeting, talk about things, and say, okay, let's come back next year and talk about it again. I'm serious. I mean, for 7 years, these people have done nothing, and they're happy with that. And I think the United States is a little more impatient, and we have people that are willing to. The other huge advantage we have is the agencies, that we know what the agencies will accept, especially when an agency is initiating it. Europe doesn't have that luxury. You have ECHA and EFSA, but even those regulatory bodies can't regulate. It's up to the individual member states to decide. So there's never an acknowledgement that, okay, if I do this test, will somebody take it? Because you can get 4 different answers from 4 different member states. Here, at least, we can say the EPA will accept this, or the FDA. So I think the answer to your question is we're going to have to do it first, and then try to work with international partners to help them adopt it. I can't think of very many situations where something has been implemented outside here that we actually could take advantage of. I think a lot of the legislation over there is misleading in what they are actually doing with the Cosmetics Act. For example, there are loopholes. You could drive a truck through it. People do drive trucks through them. So it sounds good, but almost all the major initiatives, nothing have come out of them. I think we are actually the leaders right now, as long as we keep the agencies involved in the minimum. We certainly weren't for the first part, but yeah.
Just to piggyback on that really quickly, I think, I agree, my experience has been when we, for years, were saying, the US is the only outlier, we're the only people still doing chimp research. That was not the pressure point. At no point did labs say, oh, well, New Zealand banned ape research 12 years ago, we better get on board. I mean, they only were listening when US scientists said, this is not good science.
Hi, you had said, you both talked about cosmetics before. I read everything and break the companies and this and that, so they animal testing, they have animal ingredients, do that. And a lot of times they say, we don't do animal testing unless required. And it seems to me that China requires almost everything to be animal tested. Do you think there's any movement that would change in China? Because it's really hard to find a cosmetic that says we do everything right except, we can't because of China. I mean, do you know anything about that, or
Yeah,
likelihood
so
of changing?
we started to work, we have an international collaboration that has US, Europe, China, Japan, Korea, Canada, Brazil. And China is now joining them. So there's actually a lot of interest in China to move to accept non-animal methods. But it's a fragmented regulatory situation, and it's not going to be easy or fast, but there is definitely interest from China. I mean, they're at the table, they want to do it. I think just helping them do it efficiently is a way. But again, that's a lot of that's the financial incentive. The pharmaceuticals are the same way. You do testing here, you go to China, you're going to use their labs to do the testing, not necessarily because they don't trust our results. That's how they make money, by bringing in products and forcing you to pay them to do the testing. So again, where's the incentive for them to move away from that?
And where's the incentive for US-based companies who want to sell in 2 different markets, like you were saying, to duplicate those tests? And I think, what we're trying to do with the Humane Cosmetics Act is to say, fine, we're not going to have this international component, because quite frankly, federal legislation that then tries to get into regulating international trade, you can easily run into WTO issues, and you have to be very careful how you're structuring those types of federal bills. But when we drafted the Humane Cosmetics Act, we were willing to, look the other way on testing happening outside of the U.S. while simultaneously forcing companies that want access to the U.S. market, whether they're U.S. companies or not, to get on board with alternatives, basically.
Yes, I have 2 quick questions for Sarah. First, you mentioned that the retired federal chimps were being warehoused. What did you mean by that? And second,
Yep.
You said that it costs approximately $20,000 a year to care for the retired chimps when they move to sanctuary. Who is funding that, or how is it being funded, and what restrictions, if any, are being placed on that money?
All excellent questions. So for the most part, all of the captive chimps in the U.S. who have been used in research in the past are warehoused at this point, because they can't be used, they can't or won't be used in research. There's been that population, I think when I was talking about that, I was talking about the population in New Mexico that's really warehoused on the Air Force Base. And since before all of these changes in the last couple of years, that population has been just essentially held there in sort of lab conditions with the idea that maybe someday we might need them for, Ebola 2 or, something we don't know about yet. So the rhetoric around that population has been that we're hanging on to them in case we might need them for something. Thankfully, that rhetoric has changed now. But essentially, they're all still sitting there. And there is, as Anna kind of alluded to, there's some financial incentive for the facilities that have them to keep them because they're getting money, even though they're not able to test with them anymore, they're still getting money to care for them. So there's some tussling happening behind the scenes, especially at the federal level with that federal population, between the labs that are getting federal money to keep caring for them even though they're not testing on them anymore. That's bread and butter for them. And they lose that bread and butter, and that bread and butter helps fund, maybe other programs that they're working on or staff positions or whatever. And if they move to sanctuary, it is a significant cost to build for them and to care for them. And so that money goes away. In terms of where that money is coming from, the Chimp Act provides federal funding up to a certain level for those federal chimps. So it's still tax dollars that are providing care at Chimp Haven. It's cheaper for the government at Chimp Haven because Chimp Haven, under the Chimp Act, is required, or whatever the contractor is, it happens to be Chimp Haven, required to raise 25% of the cost of care. So there's a 25% savings there where the government's paying 100% of the costs in the labs, but they move to Chimp Haven. Chimp Haven has to raise 25% of that. So it's a good deal for Chimp Haven because 75% of their costs are covered. And I would love that deal personally, but I don't have it. But it's cheaper for the taxpayers to care for these chimps. In terms of where the money comes from and what restrictions there are for that other piece of the pie in the population, I'm purely privately funded. So other than Chimp Haven, all of the other sanctuaries that are providing care for chimps are writing grants and working with people who are willing to give us $20 or $200 or whatever. To help us care for them. So there aren't unless a donor provides some restriction. We don't have those types of restrictions. At Chimp Haven, because of the Chimp Act, there are requirements to meet certain standards of care, and they have to meet the Animal Welfare Act and some other kind of regulatory stuff. But those standards are minimal. So in the sanctuary community, when I talked about NAPSA coming together and kind of aligning professionally, we helped to write the professional standards of care for great apes that are now used by the sanctuary accrediting body that accredits all kinds of different sanctuaries. So that's sort of the stretch goal in terms of really professional, gold standard care for chimpanzees in particular. That's my area. Whereas the Chimp Haven requirements are sort of a minimal level.
So in other words, if a place like Yerkes donates its retired chimps to a private sanctuary, the sanctuary would have to raise its own money to care for the chimps?
Unless there was, a contractual agreement between the sanctuary and Yerkes to provide some other, but that would be a private contract, not a public requirement.
Okay, thank you.
Sure.
And one other thing on the Chimp Haven standards that I think is interesting and definitely is converse to some of the private labs is that the NIH standards of care for chimps in Chimp Haven actually do allow non-invasive behavioral research to continue. And so that I think is an interesting area where NIH is clearly interested in cognitive research on the broad scale, and there are federal dollars that can be used for that research. To date, those types of grant monies have not flown into Chimp Haven to do the type of cognitive research, again, non-invasive behavioral observation-based research. But in theory, that type of research is allowed to continue on that population.
Anna, can I follow up on that? Where in the statutes or the regulations does it say that non-invasive research on chimps or other non-chimp primates is permissible?
So in for chimpanzees, there is an entire Federal Register notice that adopts the standards of care specifically for the National Chimpanzee Sanctuary, which is Chimp Haven currently and always has been. And in that Federal Register notice, there's an expectation of that type of research being allowed.
Thank you.
You touched upon a little bit about the military, and it seems like the DoD gets exemptions, over exemptions for things, and they do testing and research and training. there's such things as they call it live tissue tests, where we use domestic animals, pigs and goats. They'll shoot the pig and break the legs of the goats, and the training and research is to repair it, to teach medics and stuff like that. Is there anything afoot to try and get that carved out as not being allowed anymore? Would it fall under this at all, or?
That's not something that I've dealt with. I've dealt almost exclusively with their toxicology program around chemical weapons and understanding the chemistry aspect, not that aspect.
But there are absolutely efforts afoot to eliminate that type of research. The Physicians Committee on Responsible Medicine, PCRM, is very active in that realm to try to get even individual military bases to agree to stop doing that. It's a more piecemeal effort. I don't think that it's gone, to my knowledge, there isn't a coordinated campaign to get DoD to turn away from it entirely. It's kind of a case-by-case issue.
I am aware there is a federal bill that actually our committee has supported for a number of years that would mandate the elimination of certain DoD tests where there are these validated alternatives, and that's the dummy tests. I have one of our members here wrote the comment, so yeah, exactly.
Can I just make one comment? I actually want to say something good about the military in this regard. The military actually has a major interest in non-animal alternatives as well. And if you think about it, it makes sense, because if you're going to deploy soldiers or troops to the field, and they're worried about chemical weapons or radiation or things like that, they need to have sort of a quick and dirty machine, little box that can actually find those things at what levels and whether they're going to be harmful. So if you look at a lot of the research that they've done, it's been very innovative in that way. I just wanted to put that plug in for the alternatives.
Yeah, no, it used to be a requirement, some of those trainings, but when I got deployed to Afghanistan, it wasn't required anymore. But it still exists.
So I think in the 2015 budget, the Appropriations Committee in Congress asked the NIH to review the ethics of the primate research. The NIH, in my opinion, kind of dragged their heels a little bit, but then in September, they held a workshop, and the workshop basically sort of, the morning session was devoted to talking about how great primate research had been to human health, and then the afternoon session was all about just describing the current regulations in primate research, but nowhere in there was there actually a discussion of different ethical frameworks, which is what Congress had asked for. So I guess I was just curious to hear thoughts from the panel about how the whole experience with the chimpanzee reports might inform thinking about primates more generally, or whether there are important differences in how members of Congress or the public perceive chimpanzees versus other primates that might make this a sort of different task to sort of re-examine the ethics in that case. So I'm just kind of curious to hear what people think about.
My impression is that a couple things. One, that September forum was extremely frustrating. I agree with your assessment of it. I don't think it was an objective look at the value of primate research, but I also think, like Sarah alluded to at the beginning of her talk, we don't get a lot of major watershed victories in this kind of work, and the notion that the extremely fast progress that we've made on chimps in recent years is going to all of a sudden knock down all the rest of the dominoes with primate research, I think, is wishful thinking. And so that conversation has started, and it absolutely will continue. I think there are some key differences within the science that are extremely relevant there. So, for example, by the time the IOM report on chimps came out in 2011, there was already so much published literature about how useless many of these studies were, that there was a lot of scientific consensus already burgeoning before it was brought together in one specific NAS panel. Conversely, with a lot of monkey research, that scientific consensus doesn't exist. In fact, there's a lot of literature out there that, as was presented at that panel, suggests that that type of research is absolutely still necessary. So I don't think that there's a scientific consensus on broader primate research that we had on chimps prior to making the regulatory change, and I think that that's essential. I mean, I think borrowing an analogy from kind of another angle of this chimp work, which Sarah alluded to, that the use of chimps in this country was not only in labs, but also a huge pet and entertainment side of things, and the Endangered Species Act listing, kind of applies across the board to all of those different types of uses. Having the scientific community so in lockstep on the needs of chimps and the usefulness or lack thereof of chimps in research helped us totally break that logjam. Conversely, we're doing a lot of work right now on captive tigers in the US. We don't have a community of researchers in this country that are working on tigers. They basically don't exist. They're few and far between. Most of them are at zoos. There's not, a kind of body of experts that you can draw on in the same way. And I think the same is true with a lot of the other primate research that's going on, that most of the people who know about that research are invested in it and still see value in it. And until that landscape changes, it's going to be very difficult to change the regulatory landscape.
I think I'll just piggyback on that to say there's a potential with the changes that are happening with chimps to have the opposite effect, right? So we're sort of clearing room and getting the chimps out of the way, and maybe there will be a boom in monkey research, because that's sort of the next thing. And I struggle with that personally. But on the ground, in terms of that community of 6 of us, 7 of us who are directors of chimp sanctuaries, almost 10 years ago now, coming together. We didn't have any monkey people yet, and it was the North American Primate Sanctuary Alliance, but because we hoped that we would sort of expand to monkeys, but at that time we were very chimp biased, and I sort of wear that bias on my sleeve, that's my specialty, and I have focused there. But today there are 10 or 11 members of that group, and the additions have been monkey sanctuaries. And I came from a meeting a couple weeks ago of that group, which still exists. And there were quite a few people, actually speakers at that conference from labs who do monkey research, who are starting to build partnerships with sanctuaries. So it's a much bigger picture in a whole lot of ways, but it is, those conversations are starting to happen. And I think the chimp stuff set the stage to have some of those conversations. I don't think it's going to be the big, yay, we did it sort of thing, but I think those conversations are starting to happen. One of the researchers who presented at that meeting talked about how her research and her monkeys who she was researching on would have been euthanized if not for this relationship that she developed with a sanctuary. And she's now able, it's handfuls of monkeys, it's not huge numbers, but she's able to she was able to convince the administration that there was a professional sanctuary that would be able to provide good care, and now those monkeys are, that pipeline has started. So there's something there.
There's definitely movement, I totally agree, and I think the numbers issue is huge, right? I mean, at peak with chimps, we were talking about 1,200 chimps. We've got over 100,000 monkeys that are in labs today. And so the number game is a totally different landscape. The number of facilities that have the animals is much broader than the handful of labs that have ever been involved in chimp research. It's just a very different landscape from an advocacy perspective, but there's certainly